So the problem that we collectively as educators are trying to solve for this fall, in math in particular, is the fact that in a typical fifth grade classroom, even before COVID, there were 7 different instructional levels represented, with about a third of students coming into fifth grade 2 or more years behind. COVID has only made this problem worse. Research from NWA shows that the type of learning loss that students are experiencing as a result of COVID is comparable to what happens in the course of the summer, even worse. So what do schools do given the fact that students were already coming in behind before COVID and now have significant learning loss on top of that? This challenge is especially important to overcome in math because math is cumulative. If you look at this chart, you'll see, for example, that there are 37 fifth grade skills that appear on most state assessments that relate to fifth grade. But in order for students to actually learn those 37 skills, they need to have brought with them 34 skills from before fifth grade. Those are the predecessor skills represented below the number 37. And so there's really 171. In sixth grade, there are 44 new skills that appear based on state standards, but those rely upon 29 predecessor skills from fifth grade and 34 predecessor skills from before fifth grade. So there's really 107. And this chart shows us how math cascades over time. What happens practically in most classrooms is if you imagine an incoming sixth grader on the first day of school, they probably learn some skills back from before fifth grade and in fifth grade. Some they may have partially learned, and some are true learning gaps. A sixth grade teacher who would focus on sixth grade material, as you're supposed to do based on the scope and sequence adopted by the district, will focus dutifully to get through the entire scope and sequence. But as a result, some skills will be learned, many skills won't be learned, and a lot of those gaps from prior years will still persist. The student will then graduate into the seventh grade where the same pattern will emerge. The seventh grade teacher will focus on seventh grade material. The student will learn some of those skills, either fully or partially, but even more gaps will be created. And then finally, the same problem will happen in the eighth grade. Unfortunately, many students who experience this simply aren't ready for the rigors of high school mathematics. We wrote about this extensively in a report we released last fall called the Iceberg Problem. What we argued is that in many schools, a sixth grade teacher will teach sixth grade curriculum. Some of those skills will go learned and some of those skills will go unlearned. By the time the student gets into seventh grade, that student may still learn some seventh grade material, but a lot of those gaps back from sixth grade will persist and even new gaps will be created. And then the same thing happens in the eighth grade. We call this the iceberg problem because most districts and states are focused on what will appear on the state assessment. That's what can be seen above the line, above the horizon. But while everyone is focused on those grade level standards, all of this unfinished learning is accumulating below the surface, making it harder for students to actually succeed in high school and beyond. Said another way, if we imagine that there's the standard trajectory, students learn some pre-fifth grade material in fifth grade, they learned fifth grade material in fifth, sixth grade material in sixth, seventh and eighth, and so forth. That approach works for about 2 out of every 5 students. But the reality is that 3 out of 5 actually come into fifth grade below that line, below where they need to be at the fifth grade level. And what happens is if they just get grade level material, they end up falling further behind. Tailored acceleration is about building each student their own tailored path to get back to the grade level trajectory. And it could be in 1 year, it could be over multiple years. But the basic idea is to make sure that each student is able to get back to where they need to get back, regardless of whether it takes 1, 2, or 3 years. What happens then to that same sixth grader who comes in with a number of learning gaps from before fifth and fifth grade is they spend sixth grade with a mix of pre-grade, on-grade, and sometimes post-grade skills. And they work on filling those particular needs. By the time the student gets to seventh grade, they again get a mix of pre-grade, on-grade, and post-grade skills to focus on those. And then in eighth grade, the same thing happens, a mix of pre-grade and on-grade that's then ultimately filled. Overall, when schools use tailored acceleration, students are far more likely to graduate eighth grade ready for high school than by exclusively focusing on grade level material year after year. That's the idea behind tailored acceleration. And I'm now going to turn it over. Before I do that, I want to share what are the 5 big shifts that schools need to think about in order to actually move toward tailored acceleration. The first big shift is about a multi-grade focus. In the old model, teachers focus on grade level skills. But in the new model, teachers focus on a mix of pre-grade, on-grade, and post-grade skills. So if we look at this chart again, what typically happens in most 5th grade, 6th grade, or 7th grade classrooms is students are focused on what's in the blue circles, the grade level content. Focusing on multi-grade means we look at things more vertically. If you're the 7th grade teacher, we think not only about the 41 7th grade skills, but about the 29 predecessors from 6th grade and the additional ones from 5th grade and before 5th grade. Truly thinking about each student getting the right set of skills they need in order to get back to grade level as quickly as possible. The second big shift that schools can make is thinking differently about time. In the traditional model, instruction is aimed at getting all students to proficiency in a single year. And that's a tall order, particularly for students who already come in 2 or more years behind. With tailored acceleration, for some students, achieving grade level proficiency may require learning pathways that take more than a single year. So if we think back to this example here, imagine a 6th grader who comes in 2 years behind. What some schools may want to consider is, rather than trying to ensure that student gets back to grade level after 1 year in 6th grade, it might make more sense for them to focus over 2 years on the 7th grade column, or even over 3 years on the algebra column. The point is to be incredibly intentional and deliberate about putting each student on a viable path to get them back to grade level as quickly as possible, and not just to play this 1-year game that schools continue to play, despite evidence that for many students, the distance they need to travel in 1 year is just simply unlikely to succeed. The third focus is a focus on mastery. In a traditional model, teachers are often focused on coverage, of ensuring that all of the skills from the beginning of the textbook to the end of the textbook are taught in some way, shape, or form, so that students have a chance of succeeding on the end of year test. With tailored acceleration, the focus is on mastery, of ensuring that students actually don't progress until they know the foundational skills they need to progress. The fourth shift is about measuring true learning growth. In a traditional model, growth reflects performance changes on grade level assessments. The students would get a 2 on the 6th grade test, and then maybe a 3 on the 7th grade test. But those tests are actually very different standards. They have very different things that they're measuring. It's not actually measuring learning growth, it's measuring changes in relative proficiency on a year-over-year basis. Schools that are focused on tailored acceleration use assessments that allow them to understand whether students are in fact progressing on their own tailored accelerated pathway to proficiency. And those tests can be based on assessments like the NWA map that use percentiles that can ultimately be correlated to key college and career readiness benchmarks. So for example, a student that scores in the 61st percentile by 8th grade is on a college and career ready trajectory to get an ACT score of 21. At that point, schools can see what percentile each student is in 6th grade, in 7th grade, and 8th grade to ensure they're making progress toward that objective. That's just one way of measuring these sorts of interim milestones. And the final shift is thinking differently about instructional modalities. I think most teachers would agree that it would be great to put all students on their own tailored path. But how can one teacher possibly plan and deliver instruction for each student based on his or her unique needs? And that's where different modalities come in. Teacher-led instruction is still by far the most critical way that students have to learn, given how social and emotional the learning process actually is. But if we think about other modalities, collaborative learning modalities, independent learning modalities, and we think about how a teacher can make use of all of these modalities in a single classroom, you can begin to understand how a classroom or a school could operationalize each student being on their own tailored pathway. And these modalities can be implemented both in a live context or in a remote context. And Chris is going to talk a little bit about how our program sustains in both of those environments. So those are the 5 big shifts: thinking about a multi-grade, intentional multi-grade focus, making a strategic use of time, focusing on mastery as opposed to coverage, measuring true learning growth, and leveraging multiple instructional modalities so that students can learn at their own pace and with the skills that are right for them. That's the idea behind tailored acceleration. You might be thinking, well, how does a teacher actually pull that off? What are the tools available to make tailored acceleration possible? And for that, I'm going to turn it over to Chris, who's going to walk you through some of the new tools that we have to share with you.
Thank you, Joel. Hello, everybody. I'm Chris Rush. I am the co-founder and chief program officer here at New Classrooms. And yeah, let me try and make this a little bit more real for you with some of the tools that that exist out there and that we're launching this fall for the start of school to help make all this happen. We're going to talk about 3 of those today. The first is around some diagnostic assessments and some academic roadmaps to help guide the pathway for where different students and teachers need to help, and the teachers who need to help them get there. Some all digital access. I think, you know, there's a lot of curriculum that happens in the classroom, and we have different mixes of how to do that. But in this current time of COVID pandemic, kids out of school or in school for just a few days, we thought it was important to make sure that there are ways that this can happen anywhere. And then the third category is a more holistic learning model that as schools return to normal can dive in and really take students through this at a whole nother level. So with that, here we go. So I'm going to dive into this first category, which is diagnostic assessments and academic roadmaps. The real purpose here is with students having been falling behind before the pandemic in different cases, or even getting ahead, as well as all the lost learning time, it's really important for teachers and students and parents, frankly, to be able to have a detailed understanding at the skill level of what it is their students know and what they don't know. And this can be aimed within a grade level column, as Joel was talking about, or the full ladder that you need to get up to algebra. And then based off of that diagnostic, we can provide that roadmap to you for where to go. So think of it very similarly as if you needed to travel and you typed in your destination on Google Maps and you got basically turn-by-turn directions of where to go next. That's what we mean by academic roadmaps. And these are personalized for each individual student. So what does that really mean? That means we're taking these students from their various starting points and creating this pathway to get them re-caught up. And to do that, you end up with these roadmaps. You end up with overviews of what these skills actually mean. So if someone says you need to be able to multiply fractions with unlike denominators, you need to really explain what it is we're talking about. And then provide some tracking for that so we can really see whether or not folks are making progress. So when a student logs in or a teacher looks at a particular student's roadmap, they end up with this summary chart to start on their dashboard, which is saying, okay, in this case, the student is working on an algebra ladder, trying to work their way all the way up to algebra proficiency. And here's the summary status by grade level of how many skills they've completed and how many they still have remaining in each grade level there as they make their way up through algebra. From there, they can dive in, they can explore it through a concept and skill map. They can log different learning activities that they might engage in as they go on that journey. And then there's a number of summary and reports that are there on the right. And this creates a whole interface for them to explore and figure out their learning path and understand where they're going. The reports that come with that require a lot of information, summarizing how many skills do you still have remaining in your roadmap? What have you completed? What did you place out of? And then they're chunked nicely into these short groups of 3 to 5 skills that we call playlists. And that allows a student to know they might not understand everything about their map. They might not understand everything about the journey, but they know that right now they should work on these 3 skills or these 4 skills, and teachers can assign them in these chunks, or they can sort of go and explore and work on things throughout that roadmap on a custom path, depending on what makes sense for your classroom or your student. That first report was an overview of the entire roadmap. They're also available to look at by strand, so you can see how many algebraic thinking or how many statistics or geometry skills you may need to work on, how far you are along in that journey. And there's also a breakdown of that by grade level. So if I want to see all the 7th grade material that's still left, this student here has 11% of that remaining for what they need to do. Now, just a few basic logistics around all of this. The idea of this diagnostic is that it's given 3 times a year. So there are 3 administrations, beginning of year, middle of year, end of year. It's the standard adaptive test length, so 70 to 100 minutes in total, but this can be broken up into, it can be done in one sitting, or it can be broken into three parts so that you can figure out how to administer it in all sorts of different school setups. This is applicable for students through grade 4 all the way up through high school algebra. And we know, especially at times like this during the pandemic, that it's important to have access. So desktop, tablets, mobile phones, you can access these diagnostics on all of those. And you can roster it directly or through Clever, Google Classrooms. And the best part of all of this is that this initial diagnostic, or this initial set of diagnostics and roadmaps, is completely free to students and teachers for this upcoming school year. So you can take your diagnostic, you can get your roadmap, you can figure out your course, you can track the things that you have learned along the way, and that's completely for free. And we want to make sure everybody, every student throughout the country has access to be able to understand exactly where they are. Now, you might say, great, I have this roadmap, but how do I get through that? And that's where this next offering comes in, this all digital access piece that allows a student to actually engage in those skills, to be able to learn, engage in content and lessons online, some digital and some are digital print representation. So good old fashioned turn to the textbook, page 42, 2 to 30 the evens, we can still have those workbook pages made available. And this way students can engage in work or print those out if they don't have permanent online access to actually work through their skills. They can do it at school independently, they can do it at home with a parent. And then on top of that, there are formative assessments that are available for each skill so that you can know whether or not you actually learned this skill. And then the roadmaps actually adapt based on what you've learned. So whether or not you started working on a number of skills independently and you start passing the assessments to show that you understand what those skills are, or if maybe in school you're still also working on other grade level material that the rest of your class is working on, you can go and take an assessment on those, check those off too, and the system will basically reroute you to the best and fastest possible way for you to get where you're going, whether that's algebra proficiency or grade level proficiencies. And then we also have tools for parents to be able to get a refresher on the skills, to be able to help their son or daughters through their journey through the tailored acceleration. This here again is just showing how there are a variety of ways that students can travel through that roadmap in order to get where they're going through a number of these tools. Now, additionally, in these tools, we have a set of things for teachers too, to be able to look at aggregated reporting. And they will also be able to then group their students, monitor progress along the way. I'm going to show you a few screens of that, but obviously you'll be able to follow up and learn more if you're interested. Here we just have an example screen where a student's coming in and they're able to see all the different skills that they are working on in a particular category, the status of those skills. And if we sort of zoom in here, this is just a skill card with links to that skill overview, to the digital lessons, to the assessments they need to work on that updates the status of their overall roadmap. Those lessons, by the way, while there's a few that we create here at New Classrooms, most of this we are pulling from all sorts of third-party providers. We are curating the content to find best of breed to get into the system. What that allows us to do is see as different students take different lessons, which ones are working and which ones aren't. So you may have some fractions lessons from Pearson that are just kicking butt and kids are flying through, but maybe the decimal lessons are actually working better from McGraw-Hill. You know, it's really about what's working for students and being able to get those lessons teed up for our students to engage in and work on. And then here's an example of a formative assessment. Here's this particular one is a multiple choice skill related to graphing. And students can go in and take these assessments over and over again to show whether or not and demonstrate whether or not they understand the skills at hand. Some of them are multiple choice, some of them are short answer, but they're all computer scored tests so that they get the results right away and immediately to figure out if they need to do more work for what's happening. And then, of course, there's reporting. I know this can get a little smaller on the screen, but if you look closely, this is basically a list of skills, and it's providing summary information for teachers about which skills are students paused on, which ones have they passed, where do they need help, which ones have they not engaged in, and based off of this, you can pull up lists of students, pull them into groups, and then figure out when they are back in school or whether or not you want to do it virtually, how to engage with them to actually teach a live lesson, a group lesson, how you can intervene to be able to help them on their roadmap journeys. A couple basic logistics here. We think there's a number of primary use cases where this can be helpful. One of the most popular that seems to be happening with schools this year is the idea of a B day. So kids are in maybe on Tuesdays and Thursdays, but not in on Monday, Wednesday, Fridays. So in those Monday, Wednesday, Friday B days, they could be working on their personalized roadmap, taking assessments. Teachers can monitor, see how they're progressing through. And then on those A days, teachers may be able to create other lessons and group students based on how they're progressing. Or they could be marching through a standard curriculum on the A days with kids working on their roadmaps on B days, or even pulling it into school as a supplemental program. Some others are even using it as homework. So there's lots of options here. And the idea is to make these tools available to folks so that they can figure out how to best meet the needs of their students in the unique situations that I think different schools are in all over the country today. Again, for this, the student part of this, the lessons are available on laptops, tablets, and mobile, and many of the content providers do provide bilingual materials. The system is also compliant for a variety of special needs features. So we want to make sure this is available to everybody and that equity is very important as far as what happens and what we can make available to students. These types of upgrades are available for a small fee for schools, about $15 a student, but this is on top of the diagnostic and the basic roadmaps that are available for free for everybody. And then the last model and offering that I would like to talk to you about is a more holistic learning model. This is trying to take those roadmaps and systematize it within your school. The idea here is that this can be adopted for grades 5 through 11, and we want to be able to have a much richer experience for students when they can actually be in the classroom. The idea of providing a mix of online or digital instruction, along with group projects and group activities for collaborative learning, as well as teacher-led learning and project-based learning that happens over the course of multiple days and weeks. Putting that all together and then automatically taking the results that are happening each day and scheduling it for students and teachers. So you might have 20 kids that are learning how to add fractions on a given day, half of them pass it, half of them don't. What do you do the next day? What this would do is it would regroup the students, reassign the teachers, and make sure that people could move forward on their journeys, but in much richer ways without putting that same legwork on the teachers and students to figure out their pathways through or to do that grouping of the students. This is a full school integration. It's automated. It comes with additional support. There are daily exit slips or assessment for kids so that we know what worked on a given day. It helps us improve content. That helps us figure out where to move students to. And it happens in all the multimodal ways I was talking about, as well as bringing in the idea of remote and in-school coherence. This is the idea that while there are many academic programs and programs that meet students where they are instructionally, we also want to meet them where they are geographically. So just like when you do your email, you may do it on your mobile phone or you may do it on your laptop. It's a different experience, but it doesn't matter whether or not you do more on your phone or more on your laptop. Either way, you're able to engage in that email. And we think the same thing should be true for your learning. If there is more time spent in school, you should be able to engage and move forward. And if there is less time spent in school, you should also be able to engage with that learning either way without it interrupting what's happening. So what does this look like in practice? Here we have a student, her name is Maria, and she comes to school just like any other school day. Here she comes, first period, she may have gym class, second period, she may have English class, but third period, she's gonna go to math, in which case she's gonna go to the math center, which can be sometimes a larger open space or a set of classrooms that are all next to each other. When she does that in this particular school, she's in an open space where there are different learning stations to engage in the different activities that are being scheduled. Some of those activities are teacher-led, working with a teacher. Others are students working collaboratively in a group with manipulatives. And in other cases, it's still a student working independently online because it's a moment where they need targeted help on a specific skill or topic. So for Maria, she walks into the classroom, she sees two big screen televisions, sort of like when you go to the airport and you look up where your gate is and where you need to go. She finds her name, which is always in the same spot, and it tells her which learning station she needs to go to, what modality she'll be working in, and what teacher will be there to greet her. On this particular day, she starts out in a live instruction with a teacher, and she's able to be walked through her skill or lesson that she's working on. Then music plays, kids get up, they transition, and they go to their next learning station. In this case, she's working on a peer-to-peer activity with another student in her class, and they are tag teaming and working together in order to try to solve a problem, and they're able to help each other out. And then after that, her learning sessions are done. She goes back to her main math homeroom, and she takes a 5-question exit slip to figure out whether or not she has been successful that day in mastering the skill, or whether or not she's going to need another try at that the next day in another way. And if she does, she'll work with a different teacher and a different set of students through different content to try to learn what she's learning. And if she did master it, she'll move on and she will start working on her next skill. And then after that, she heads out. The system processes her exit slip result. We figure out where all the students should go the next day. And while that's happening, she heads off to science class and continues on through her school day. And with that, I'm going to transition it back to Joel to talk you through.
Great, thank you, Chris. So Teach to One Math is the holistic learning model. Schools can implement that as a core or as a supplemental program. All the operational support and academic support is part of that. As Chris mentioned, we have a number of adaptations that can enable Teach to One happen in a remote context. We actually had schools last year that ran all the modalities, albeit remotely. And that's $135 per student, excluding any costs involved with NWEA MAP. So that's sort of a summary of the 3 offerings we have. We've got a number of questions that have come in, so I'm going to tee some of those up for Chris. If people want to open up the chat box with more questions, I will start queuing them up. So Chris, the first question is, how long are the math periods?
So math periods can range anywhere from 35 minutes to 60 minutes. Our most preferred setup is to have sort of block scheduling to 80 to 90 minute periods, but we are able to set this up in a variety of contexts, anywhere from 35 minutes to all the way up to 100 minutes.
Second, what is the minimum number of students for the holistic learning model?
So for the holistic learning model, historically, people may have read that that's been about 60 to 80 students. We now have classroom editions of this, so it's generally been 20. And then we are working through this period of COVID to try to get that down even to 12 to be able to study.
Is information provided bilingually, Spanish specifically, but there are others?
A number of the third-party content providers do have multiple language support. Our online web portal is translatable with the tools on top to work with Google Translate. A number of schools do that in the case, but there are a few of the content providers that are teed up through our system that haven't yet gotten all of the additional languages that we'd love to see. Now, in this world of heightened remote learning, we're seeing those numbers improve significantly over the course of this summer. So we're hoping that that just continues to increase.
When will the digital program launch?
So all three offerings are planned for launch at the beginning of this school year. Some of them have been running, some of them are doing upgrades too. But basically, we're setting the launch dates as August 31st right now, and people will be able to dive in with the diagnostics, and the rest of the features and aspects will be rolling out over the first month of school, but kids will be able to get in right away.
Chris, can you talk about how this might work given the varying and uncertain learning environments due to COVID?
Yeah, in many ways, these adaptations have been set up specifically to try to address that. As I was saying before, this idea of not just meeting students where they are academically, but also meeting where they are location-wise and physically. So, especially the all digital access program, the idea there is that in a COVID world, there are a few different challenges. One is students aren't in school to begin with, and therefore they have different and varying levels of online access. The idea that we can have them go take a diagnostic, that they can get someplace on any device for 75 to 90 minutes to take that basic diagnosis or that diagnostic seems to be true. We were working with a number of schools over the spring, and we seem to be able to get every student, regardless of their situation, into a context where they could do that as long as there was some basic level of engagement. But realistically, the challenges for additional learning in this COVID time come in a couple flavors. One is you may have students that end up needing to learn remotely, but they don't have regular digital access, or they can't all get together to do an online Zoom meeting at 2 p.m. I think it's really important to be able to have online, on-demand content that they can work on whatever time they are able to get online, both for the content and the assessment. And then additionally, some students were only able to get online at a library, at a friend's house, at a family member's house, but very limited access, and therefore not just having online activities, but also having print activities that can be printed out is key. Whether or not that's printed out directly by the student, or whether or not there's times when they stop into school for one day a week, they get a packet of the next activities. This allows us to tee up students for that. And then most importantly, I think we have to acknowledge that whatever the transition is back into the classroom, it will likely be mixed with some days in school and some days out of school. So being able to have flexibility about how much time students are in school and can dial up the use of their roadmap, or spend time out of school and dial up or down the use of their roadmap, I think is key. We got to run a number of pilots of different parts of this over the spring, and saw stronger success on that than we expected, both on the gamut of kids working independently, but as Joel talked about, all the way through multi-day projects that teachers were leading students through when they could get online at the same time. But is it a substitute for being in school 5 days a week? No, but let's see how we want to get as close as humanly possible.
And what type of online support is offered for students having trouble logging in or accessing lessons?
Yeah, so there are two types of support that exist through this. One is just basic technical support. So being able to email, online chat, those aspects. So as long as your computer is online, even if you're having login challenges or whatnot, there are folks you can chat or email with to be able to help you through that process. Also, it's really important in the digital age now, data security, especially with credentials. And therefore, what we're not doing is creating credentials and having teachers email or give those out. But what will happen is that students will be able to create their own login and be able to reset their passwords themselves. Teachers will be able to give them an access code. So once you create your account, the teacher gives the student the code, and then they get associated with the class. So the student will always be able to reset in case any problems happen. And it will all happen in a secure way because there is no transmission of username and passwords.
What kind of PD do you offer for teachers pre-implementation?
Yeah, so for the free offerings, there will be online tutorials. There will be videos, there'll be PDF documents and instructional guides that take you through. Additionally, we're going to be having a series of webinars. We're still working out what the exact schedule of those is, but they're going to focus on different groups. So webinars where students and parents can better understand how to navigate the roadmaps, and webinars for teachers and coaches, and probably ones for administrators too, to understand the high-level reporting. Depending what the demand is, we'll adjust with what frequency we end up scheduling those. The idea to start though, especially for the start of school or before school starts, we'll be laying out a schedule for each week about when people can attend. The idea is to have live versions of that and recorded versions of that, because we recognize that teachers also may have challenging schedules during this time, and we want to make sure we're as flexible as possible. Most states are largely based on Common Core. Our system is set up largely based on Common Core. The difference between a standard and a skill, so people understand, an example of a Common Core standard would be a student will be able to add, subtract, multiply, and divide fractions. You can't actually teach a student how to do all 4 of those things at the same time. So we break that into 4 skills, one about learning how to add fractions, one about subtracting fractions, multiplying, and dividing fractions. And that's all tied back to the Common Core basis of skills, and our items are a combination of items from multiple sources that have been validated and verified in relation to Common Core.
What are the options that schools have when they consider this program with their core district adopted curriculum?
Yeah, I think the digital access and the academic roadmaps and diagnostics are meant to be supplementary tools to complement what's going on with your district adopted curriculum. The idea there is that you may be in school teaching, marching through the curriculum, the scope and sequence as laid out. Any of us who have done any teaching run into the moment when you have to move on, and there are a number of students who did not actually pick up that skill. You could assign it to them on their roadmap. You could help highlight it on their roadmap. Or you can say, please in parallel be marching through this. And I think that especially is true on the A and B day setup. But one of the most interesting versions of running that we saw with folks is they said, look, I don't have time to coordinate everything that's happening on the roadmap with each student and what I'm teaching. So what they did is they have the students go in and they can just mark off skills that are ahead on their roadmap that might have been taught based on the district scope and sequence already. And therefore they can mark those off, or they can take a formative assessment on them to show that they know it. And then the roadmap will readjust for them based off of what it is they're learning. So students might be learning on 2 tracks. One is which is what's happening in the standard scope and sequence. The other of which is happening on the roadmap. And the roadmap will continually adapt to try to reconcile those 2.
Chris, do the skills take into account conceptual knowledge or just low-level DOK 1 and 2?
Yeah, great question. So when we are talking about skills, we are talking about the procedural, conceptual, and in many cases, the application level of that skill. It's not that helpful, especially when trying to climb that ladder of learning, if you can only procedurally do it. If you don't conceptually understand it, you're not going to be able to understand or master any of the successors. How robust that skill knowledge is will depend on what level of these offerings you're engaging in. So the very basic one that's giving you the roadmap is laying out for you what you're expected to be able to know, the vocabulary, etc. It's not providing that content as richly as on the other end of the spectrum in the holistic learning model that's trying to do it through 7 or 8 different modalities and group projects to make you do it. The digital access version is somewhere in the middle.
This one I think I'll take because I spend a lot of time with kids and teachers and administrators. In general, what do kids, teachers, and administrators and or parents love the most about Teach to One, and what excites them? Well, we've done a number of webinars with our school partners in the past, and the 3 key things that I always hear from them are, number 1, they love the fact that each student can be met where they are. Each student feels successful. Teachers know that when a teacher is teaching a skill that's 2 years beyond where a student is, or frankly, a skill that a student already knows, it's very demotivating for a student. But when they get the right education for them, the motivation that students have is far more important and far more impactful than if they're just getting the same curriculum for everyone. The second is what I hear from teachers, which is how they are now able to differentiate. This is why many of them came into this profession to begin with. They're seeing how successful their students are, but when they're doing live instruction, because we're continually regrouping students for them, they know, for example, that if they're delivering a lesson on factoring trinomial to 16 students, they know all 16 students have mastered all of the predecessor skills to learn that, and none of them already know it. So those teachers can move much more quickly because they can truly know that each student is ready for that lesson. And then the third thing they like the most are the results. When they actually see what happens on various adaptive assessments and the kinds of growth that kids can make. We released a third-party study last year, which sort of which proved this out. Students are making roughly 1.5 years worth of gains in a single year. And when teachers see students making those kinds of gains, everybody wins.
Joel, real quick, I just want to add, can I add one thing to that one too? So especially in our holistic model, the other thing that comes up more than anything is that unlike an off-the-shelf product, we're not saying that you are on your own. We have on-the-ground support that ends up trying to improve teacher practice, help figure out what to do with challenging students, developing sort of the instructional culture of your set of math teachers. And if there's one thing that stands out the most on the feedback surveys we get, it's that people aren't alone to be able to do it, and they're able to leverage experts and the experts that are spending time in other schools in order to pull this off. It's going to be really interesting how that plays out during this time of COVID, the same way, and doing that virtually. But that's one of the most exciting parts, I think, about how we deliver the holistic model.
So at any point, students can take an assessment on a skill that is on their roadmap, but they did not do the digital lesson for?
Correct. So it may be that you received instructions through the standard scope and sequence or core curriculum from the district in the classroom. A student shouldn't spend their time retaking a lesson on something they already know. They want to skip ahead and say, look, I already know this. We actually call that type of assessment a prove it. They can just show that they already know it, test it, and go. Other times a student can say, you know what, I need some more help on this, or I'm looking at this for the first time and therefore I need to engage in some online lessons.
The next one I think I can take, how many different grade levels of students have participated in your holistic method or Teach to One math? We have served students as young as the 4th grade and as old as the 12th grade. The program does go through Algebra 1. There are a number of, in some cases, high school students that are not through Algebra 1. So we serve students up through high school, but most of the students are in grades 5 through 11. The next one is, do you have anything for grades K through 3? Answer is unfortunately not. Our focus has really been on the middle grades, 4th grade through algebra. Next one is, if my school yeah, please.
And Joel, on that one, I want to, so, and to clarify, we don't have anything for grades K through 3 grade level proficiency. We assume that when we get a 4th grader or a 5th grader or even an 8th grader, there may be key skills back from K through 3 that they need to work on. And we do have content for those. We just aren't marching up a ladder to 2nd grade proficiency that same way. We also, if a student wants to get started, who is younger, they could get started on the 4th grade and start working on that multiple years in advance. However, depending on what level of the program you're doing, that you start running into literacy and other content appropriateness.
If my school partnered with you, what is the lead time to launch the program?
Yeah, so if it's different for the 3 different levels of offering. If you would like to use the diagnostic and roadmap, the one that's free, you can literally go to a computer, sign up on the website, take it on the spot. So there's 0 lead time. Going towards the next tier with the all digital access, it's similarly, there'll be multiple payment methods, but it can be as quickly as on the spot. If you're going to do the holistic learning model though, that tends to take weeks, if not a month or two to get set up. It depends on how ready you already are and what your situation is. We've done it in as little as 3 weeks and as much as 2 years for schools to have conversations and decide what they need to do. But realistically, I'd plan a month.
Great. Let's see. How do you recommend motivating students through their learning roadmap?
Yeah, it depends a little bit on what level of the program you're doing. In our earliest versions of any of the programs, we tried to gamify things. We tried to have game boards and points so that as kids moved through various things. And what we found is what motivated students at one school dramatically, spectacularly did not motivate kids at another school. And so what we've done is we've tried to put a lot of the puzzle pieces that allow teachers and administrators to try to create incentive systems. So that can be points, that can be badges, that can be major milestones that end up happening, scores that allow you to sort of build out those types of games. That is one aspect of what's going on. As Joel discussed earlier, what gets at least half the group is actually just appropriately meeting students where they are and not feeling like it's impossible to work on things. So we see that that's huge. But I think there's these extra challenge of how do you engage students when they are remote, when you don't have access to them. How do you get them to actually pick that up and participate? And the best practices we've started seeing for that is making sure there is information available to them, making sure there is actual choice about when and how and which lesson activities they do, making information available to their parents so they can engage as well, and making sure that there are lifelines and pathways forward when students get stuck. And that's especially when we're talking about those grouping tools and things that we can surface to teachers so they know when to reach out to a student who's getting stuck. None of that can substitute from when you're sitting in a classroom and able to just walk over to a student and figure out that actually they're not motivated because they just broke up with their significant other. But there are a number of aspects that we think can still be done virtually and remotely to do that. One other thing in there is by adding, the online assessments that are there also have comments, so there's constant feedback that teachers can give. The more teachers engage with students, the more an adult engages with students, the more participation we tend to see from the students.
Great. Do most of your partners use this as their core or supplemental math program? Your high-level thoughts on this?
The majority of our partners have been using a holistic model as a core program, but there are a number that have used it as supplemental, and most recently a combination. So especially in high school, so they'll use it as core in algebra for 9th and sometimes 10th grade, and then recognizing that students still aren't all the way through everything they need to learn, and therefore we'll have those students continue in a supplemental form as they're working on algebra 2 or geometry moving forward in their learning. So we definitely see both. The biggest driver seems to be the accountability system and what different scores you're trying to aim at in a given year.
All right. Well, I think we are at the close here. I want to thank everybody for joining us and for your thoughtful questions. So if you have any other questions, we look forward to working with you. We're a nonprofit organization, and we are really focused exclusively on looking for schools that really share in these values of truly meeting each kid where they are and getting them to where they need to be. So if you think that that fits your school, that fits what you're looking for, we'd love to talk more. Thank you all so much, and we look forward to connecting with you in the future.